Hey, Boomhauer back here. I want to discuss casualties, especially in zombie layers, but this would also apply to any rally that you're running. Uh, just kind of how casualties work, and also things you should be considering based on troop type. So we have a couple things here in the photo album ready to go for this. Let's start with this one. This is a quiz question, which first of all, I don't think this game explains casualties very well at all. So I'm hoping this could be a good reference because this issue comes up a lot. And even I didn't fully understand this until kind of recently. So you see this quiz question, but it's not really clear exactly what this means, what it means by casualty priority. We all know the right answer because we've done this 1,000 times, but what this really means is that during the battle, if you're using the fighter formation, which until recently was the only formation you could use, fighters stand on the front lines. Behind them are riders. Behind them are vehicles, are shooters, and then vehicles are in the very back. So, how does that actually manifest when you run a layer? We can look at a couple examples here. So, I'm fighter based. So, this is what I used to do for a really long time. I'd run a layer and then I would ask one troop to join, and the one troop should be non-fighter. Vehicles were the best based on previous testing we had done. We saw the fewest casualties with vehicles. But whether people send one rider, one shooter, or one vehicle, this all kind of works similarly. So we see here, if I do a solo on a 42, the total wounded are about 2,100, and all of those wounded hit my troops. So let's compare that to, not that one, this one. So one player here, who's a rider, sent full troops in support of my fighters here. So if you add up these two numbers, 1279 and 712, you get about 2,000. So the total number of casualties is a little bit lower than what I did with a solo. But what you can see here is that the wounded are divided up somewhat proportionally among me and Moobs. And we'll get to why that is when we look at a replay in a few minutes. This is a third example of where three other players sent full troops in support of my fighters. All of them were either riders or shooters. I believe actually all of these were riders. And we see kind of the same thing. 770 plus the other three combined are a little over 1,300. So same kind of ballpark, around 2,100 total casualties. So if you send full troops, that does not mean that the total casualties in your layer has to go up. That's the first misconception about doing these full support layers like this. And we're going to see why that is when we go back into the game and look at a replay. I clicked the wrong thing. This was actually a 44, but I think we'll see the same thing here. So when I run this 44, I send full fighters, and then everybody else should send full troops that are not fighters. So if we look at what was sent here, people sent shooters, riders. Doesn't look like anybody sent vehicles. And these are against T12 units. So that's the other nice part about combination layers, is you can usually do a layer or two higher than you can solo yourself. And I owe FF1 a lot of credit, especially Beers and Zombies, JD, Twinkle, yeah, among others. A lot of credit for teaching me about these combination layers. So if you click on that play button right under verse, we can go in here and see what's actually happening during the battle. So my fighters are there in the front line, riders behind them, shooters behind them, just as the casualty order would have told you would happen. But what we're going to see during this battle is that the enemy never breaches my fighter line. My fighters are the only units that the enemy actually comes into contact with. So that report that you saw about riders and shooters also being casualties is extremely misleading. All of the casualties in these layers are coming from my line of fighters. And then after the battle, that number of casualties, which was around 2,000, 2,100 on the level 42 layers, is divided proportionally among all units that joined. So even though the riders and shooters did not actually get wounded or become casualties during the battle, afterwards, when they do that proportional, assignment, they do become casualties. And the reason they do that is because if they did it based on what actually happens and what the replay shows, only fighters would be casualties, which would be pretty unfair. So the two ways you can beat a zombie layer, the first way is to defeat 100% of their units, which is not typically how we beat a layer. The other way is to deplete their morale to 0, and by the time you deplete it to 0, you need to kill at least 50% of their units. So that's how we won this 44, and how we win most battles. So again, you see here, Dora, who sent shooters, had about 2,300 wounded. However, none of her shooters were actually wounded during the battle. My fighters were wounded during the battle, and then it spread it out proportionally afterwards based on march size. So if you go into the Hall of War here, you can click on this formation preview. This is something new that happened within the last few months. So me being a fighter formation is what I want to be using as a fighter. However, if you're a shooter, you can switch to that and see what would happen. If you are a shooter and you are using the shooter formation, your shooters now stand in front, and then fighters or riders can send full marches in support of you. And you can take advantage of the same thing that fighters get all the time. Let's go back here to one other photo. So this is a guide, assuming you do not have rider or shooter formations unlocked. This is what you should be sending to layers, and always send full if you have the option, because it'll help spread out the casualties among everybody and not just the leader. So if you're a fighter, you can send full marches of any of the other 3 troop types. When you're a rider, you can only send shooters or vehicles, because if you send fighters, those are in the front lines and exposed and will get wounded. They're not protected by the leader, who is a rider. If the leader is a shooter, you don't want to send fighters or riders because they're standing there in front and are going to get wounded. They're not protected at all. They're not sitting behind the rally leader, who presumably is the strongest player joining. So you can only send vehicles to a shooter rally. So the way that you can get around that, I believe when the Research Center is level 28, you get this Formations tab, which I haven't put a lot of effort into this because I'm a fighter, so I don't need the shooter or rider formations. Also, this stuff takes forever. You see this protected gas here. Even to get to level 4, that is over 11 days for me. And level 5 was even worse that I did for the protected wood. I think it was like 20 days or something. If you're a rider or a shooter, though, you do want to get down to these formations. Fair warning, these I've heard take a very long time to research. You can see based on the diamond cost that it's going to be a substantial time, because the resources don't explain why it should cost 140,000 diamonds. So if you go down to these formations, be prepared with a lot of speed ups. You'll need to get research to level 5. In order to do that, you can see this took research speed up level 5. And to get that to level 5, you'll basically need to get everything before that to level 5, which will take a lot of time. So hopefully that explains a little bit more how casualties work and how the video and the battle report are telling you different stories and kind of why they're telling you different stories. Because, what is that? This 44, we just didn't send enough support. Yeah, but this is what you should be doing. You should not be soloing layers. It does not affect the total number of casualties. By doing these combination layers, if you do them correctly, you will not suffer more casualties, but you can do higher layers than you can do yourself. On the other hand, if we had done this 44 and somebody sent full fighters, and those fighters are weaker than mine, those fighters would be mixed with mine in the front lines and suffer a lot of casualties, and all of us would have, like 30,000 casualties at the end of this battle. The only reason that somebody should send full fighters to my layers are if the fighter is stronger than me, somebody like Jaco or something, but Jaco would be better off leading the rally if that situation came up, and then I would support him with shooters or riders. Although he doesn't need that because he can already run 45s by himself. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions about it, feel free to contact me in-game on Discord or wherever else.